Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker to find out how they are looking at, how they are thinking about their times and their life. And through those conversations we are trying to advance the frontier of architecture thinking. If you haven't noticed, we are in the middle of a fantastic virus outbreak. Part of those conversations, I spoke to my friend Nandan Balsavar, whom I met almost 2 decades ago in the Center for Environmental Planning and Technology, or CEPT University, as it's known now in Ahmedabad. And we became really good friends and have been in touch over the years, and he's an academic like me running a School of Architecture in Chennai, India. I asked him how the teaching is going and how he's doing and how his students are adapting to learning on Zoom. You'll be surprised by how they are doing it. Listen to the conversation and let me know what you think. Here we go.
Well, Nandan, welcome to Architecture Talk. It's always a pleasure to sit down and talk with you. I remember our good times in the canteens of CEPT in Ahmedabad in the early 90s, when CEPT was CEPT and the things were cool and all kinds of interesting conversations were to be had around chai and samosa with the glorious company all around. Varki, the dean and director, and Chaya and all kinds of other faculty. And that was the amazing thing about the School of Architecture in Ahmedabad, at least in those days, that it still felt like a center of unbridled intellectuality. It was overshadowed by certain figures, but nevertheless, it felt like a freewheeling place. So my question is, how is unbridled architectural intellectuality doing in India in the times of Narendra Modi and COVID-19? How is this business faring under Zoom, under the regime of Zoom and social isolation?
So I would think that the unbridled expression is in full, I would say in full expression, in full bloom.
Flourishing, full bloom.
Flourishing, full bloom.
It has not been
any
throttled, it has not been, isolated with COVID.
I'm not sure, because I think the online space suddenly gives a new kind of security.
Yeah. So even though we have masks across our face and we are isolated in space, but therefore online we are like dhamadham, huh?
Absolutely. See, I think there was a seamless, at one level, it may sound a little, looking back, at another level, there was a seamless transition. I was just wondering if such a situation had happened 20 years ago, 22 years ago, when there was no WhatsApp and you didn't have a proper internet, no Zoom. I think it would have been in a very different kind of social cohesion, And at least a certain segment of society. I don't want to generalize across segments. Of course, a large segment is still denied this access of space that we have.
Yeah.
But I would think that there was already a culture on social media of unbridled expression.
Well, it was, but it still felt a bit old timer in the sense that either people were posting advertising, I'm so cool and I'm doing so well, that kind of fake stuff, Otherwise, social media, this kind of Zoom stuff was either, business necessity or still felt like a, telephone, like, okay, let's do it, but let's get it done and over with. Now there is a new
Yeah,
normal to Zoom. No, I mean, it's
yeah,
like,
I would agree. That I would agree. That see the fact that there's no choice,
yeah,
the fact that one has to continue a communication and there's no choice,
yeah,
and I think that has set us into this kind of a acceptance.
yeah,
As long as we had the choice, even though we knew that cost to bring someone down, or this always looked like a plan B kind of a situation which you didn't want to exercise.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And so there was this, I would think, a very subtle unstated prejudice. If suppose there was a conference on
yeah,
Zoom
yeah.
1 year back or 2 years back, it would have been
Nobody would.
treated as
Second class.
something. Yeah, not that you've not put in your best.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
yeah, so I think the connotations of what happens between the virtual and the embodied is something which has fascinated me for quite some time. I would say the last 15 years to I've been kind of negotiating what happens between this digital virtual space and the embodied experience, and how do the two start conversing in ways by which you can create another kind of an experience, and so I'm not too much for this conventional shift that thinks the embodied now has gone onto the digital platform and can be. So that's the kind of discourse which is on at the moment in India.
So what
And
is the relationship? How do they hybridize?
uh, now this is a lot of this is speculative. And in the like we've just finished the studio online now. We from March to now we finished it online,
Yeah.
and so one part of the speculation has been that we have tended, it's like when CAD came in, when the computer aided design CAD came in, those drawings, and CAD was pretty much became a mere replacement for the pencil.
It still is. It's
CAD,
such a stupid
it
software.
still is. Yeah,
Yeah.
it still is. And so it just replaced the pencil in a certain way,
Hmm.
but took away the embodied experience of the connection between hand and mind, and what
Yeah,
Yohani
that's right.
Palasma and others
Yeah.
talk about. And it took that away, but it just became another representation of a pencil drawing. It didn't bring in a dimension of reimagining representation, you know
Hmm.
which one would have been happier with, or I
What
think that
about,
would have really.
yeah,
Yeah,
so has Zoom done that?
i'm I'm not sure Zoom has done that, but what Zoom has done definitely is brought a certain user friendliness to that communication. At best, it's brought a user friendliness. And but Zoom by itself, uh, I was talking to Sharon Rothbard, in Jerusalem, and I think across several studios across the world, the online studios have not managed to convey. So either the student, especially in the design, if it was
Mm.
theory subjects, it's fine. But I think in the design studio, they've not got the kind of outcomes they expected, and there are a whole host of reasons, which we've been looking into very carefully, because our next semester is to start.
Hmm.
um, but at the same time, if a new imagination or several new imaginations are evoked, the same Zoom or whichever, the Google Meet, or there are enough of those platforms, can become a certain anchor for reopening a complete new imagination, rather than being a substitute to communication. What has tended to happen is that we have attempted to look at the digital now, or Zoom, or any of these platforms, as a substitute for that communication. Uh, it's on
How,
mute.
how is it new? I mean, you're saying that it's opening new things. Um, so is it opening an alternate communication application ability, or what do you think?
Yeah, it is opening, or these are early stages. So one is observing it a little carefully, but the possibilities that are opening up are something one had not clearly perceived in the studio as a singular space. Now, what do I mean by that? If I have to give a few transactions, we have one student who is from the Northeast, from the Khasi community, a remote bamboo village. We have one student from a remote small town in Kerala, few from Auroville. So we have some uh, students from Auroville, Pondicherry. So what happens is when they come into the singular studio space, and it pretty much happened in SEPT or in any school of architecture, that when they come into that space in first year, I think as an architectural practice itself, we tend to want to the whole pedagogy is one of cleansing the person of his past, because he has to now be introduced to this idea of modernity.
Mhm.
And so there's a very subtle or maybe overt or a way of, through design, the very Bauhausian way in which graphics is taught,
Mm.
the way in which history is taught, that we think that it is now engaging in a transformation or a critical thinking that we put into that student.
Mhm. Okay.
If very crudely put, this is how we perceive it. Now, what happens here when the student's location is the home and not the studio?
Mhm.
But now we get what we are defining as this virtual learning community. The studio now, as an imagination, has been extended from the Northeast to Kerala and maybe even to New Zealand, and as an imagination
Spatial
and
imagination. Yeah.
spatial imagination,
Mm.
and that spatial imagination sets off a set of responses in the student very different from the kind of responses that may have happened when the student was in the studio away from home.
So what you're saying is what Zoom does is that it actually makes the studio room the size of India in your case.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Or even to this, now we
So
have students
the
from the
room doesn't
Southeast.
disappear. It actually becomes that big.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the room can morph, because if one student leaves for a certain smaller project, another student comes in, we have a student from Malaysia coming in or from New Zealand, this whole room is morphing.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
changing all the time.
yeah, it's changing. It is,
So when we bring people into our physical room of a studio space, there's a sort of a, it's sort of like an isolation chamber. We try and cut it off, and we
yeah,
try and say, forget the rest. Now you're
absolutely.
in a special zone, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
now it's like you are in this zone which is both infinite and morphing, and yet in a contained zone. Yeah.
Absolutely. So there is a containment, there's a conversation,
Hmm.
but you cannot sense the boundary now.
Yeah. Or the boundary sort of becomes fuzzy,
Nebulous,
but it
liminal.
is huge. Yeah.
It's huge. It can expand, it can come close, it can disappear. And
But I
what
would
that
argue what the interesting thing about what you are saying is that it's not that the boundary disappears. There's sort of a reconstitution of the boundary.
absolutely agree. When I say disappears, I mean that you don't sense it. It is there, but you
Yeah.
don't. It doesn't. It doesn't kind of define you in the way the studio had been defining. Where the
Yeah,
wall
yeah,
is
yeah.
there at your. Uh, Here it doesn't, because now the student is also moving, and so what we did was we set up projects and the program. I had to change the entire program
Uh,
to meet this, to converse with this situation.
okay, what did you do?
So we changed the program, and what we did was we said that we are removing the idea of a program.
I see. Removing the program.
Yeah, removing the idea of the program. And the reason we did it, what had happened at that time when the lockdown was announced, and which I think now on hindsight, it was done intuitively. Now I'm putting a structure to it. It was done very intuitively at that time.
Yeah.
Because it just didn't feel right to set that program, send it there, ask them to start work, and that.
So what did you
it just didn't.
Yeah.
So what we did was we said there's no program, and we said we start with reimagining the home as a laboratory. Since we are quarantined in the home, we reimagined the home as a laboratory. That was the only sentence or statement provided to the student, the reimagination of a home as a laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
And for that, the student began to not take part in studio, but live their normal life and document that life as a kind of a cultural landscape that came into the studio.
Okay.
So suddenly we had a remote Khasi community, from measure drawing to database and we had the grandmother on video talking. We had the father feeling he has to also communicate, and similarly in Kerala, the grandmother talking, and a whole gathering or collation of oral histories which we would have never got from an 80-year-old Khasi tribal grandmother and that conversation between the students, understanding where they came from and a certain legitimacy given to it, which generally tends to vanish when they come into the studio. They don't bring that into the studio. Now, a legitimacy given by dislocating the station of that conversation really enriched the entire studio. But at the same time, there was a here and now where they were addressing the fear of the lockdown, the uncertainty, the reorganization of the home as a workplace, the reorganization of family members within the confines of the home. All that became valid documentation to evolve the program of the studio. So suddenly there was a sync of design and what they were handling in real life. Otherwise, generally a studio project is set up hypothetically. It is may or may not be in sync with real life. And now I'm more stating it intuitively because I won't say it was a conscious. We just started moving intuitively and seeing how do we really build up this notion of spatial occupation, spatial understanding. But now, because we don't have the benefit of a site visit, we don't have a benefit of them going and looking at a case study and coming down. We don't have the benefit of them having the embodied experience of touching materials. We said, let's shift the locus to the home. They document the furniture in the home. They document the materiality of the home. They measure the windows. They measure the doors. So what happens is they slowly start engaging in the reality of their own home and reimagining that home in several layers. So in another week, we would coming out with a monograph of this, because the layering, the thought process. So suddenly there was a shift between, I know we discuss this often, but for some reason doesn't happen in such a strong manner. There was a shift between the nuances of process versus the finality of the project and the form at the end of the studio.
Okay, no, but let's back out. How does this decentering of the studio, if I may call it, via Zoom, this dispersal via Zoom, how does this interact with and critique the traditional studio with its opposite imagination, where you would be in one space and you'd be possibly working on an abstract site somewhere else? Not an abstract, but a distant site. Let's say everybody's in Chennai in a studio, the site may be in Pondicherry, right? Or somewhere else. Or Seattle. So, which is the reverse situation. Now here you have everybody working on various sites, which is very intimate to them, my own home and bedroom. So what is the relationship between these two?
What tends to happen here now is that there is an inversion. There is an inversion of the entire studio process now because the location has shifted. Earlier, the location would have been the studio and they would go to site maybe for a week, gather the site and come back.
Yeah, but what is the implication of this inversion on the traditional understanding of studio?
It completely changes in the sense that in the traditional understanding, and this is not to bring in any value statement at the moment. It may emerge later, but in the traditional understanding, when the minute we distance ourselves, we are back to the Renaissance man, where we distance the act of the making from the drawing and set up the subject object conversation all the time, and then believe that it generates a certain abstraction. What tended to happen in that distancing was that a more embodied experience of whether it's space, whether it's material, whether it's the act of living had to be stretched. One had to stretch, and so it depended on the capacity of each student on how much one could abstract or how much one could engage in critical thinking before one draws anything on the board in a studio, which is a distilled, distinct space set up consciously away from reality in order to critique that reality. Now what happens is that it almost becomes one of a design that is emerging on site. I'm not setting any value judgments on which is better or which is not. One is not setting any values on that. I'm just saying there's an inversion where I find the student is able to get a better understanding of the home, a better understanding of inhabitation of the home, and still abstract. It doesn't take away. The embodied real experience of being in the home doesn't take away from the abstraction.
Okay, but this seems like a familiar debate, like for instance, yeah, like you said, our modernist, Eurocentric, supposedly Renaissance-derived, abstraction-based studio pedagogies with their orthographic projections is designed to sort of disembody the architectural object and therefore introduce abstraction and conceptuality into it. Now, we have been arguing about that in schools of architecture. Therefore, other people think that design build is the real thing. You go out there and you build it actually and hammer the nails and you do all that sort of a thing. Or you have to be immersive education. You go out there in the community, you build with the community. That sounds like a familiar debate.
One is not going down that road, because that debate has with it a tinge of nostalgia of the site, of working with hands-on. There's a celebration of dirting one's hands, so to say, and so it sets up two binaries which should not have been binary. And so if one really looks at it a little closer, I don't want to generalize, but if one looks at it a little closer, often the hands-on may in terms of a critical understanding may not be strong enough. It's emotive, it's experiential, it is a great space maybe, but in terms of saying something more than what it is, it generally tends to have a problem there. I don't want to generalize, but so we set up these binaries of a very intellectual process that is creating a spatial formation versus a hands-on. Here one is not discussing the hands-on.
So to return, one of the things we are finding here in Seattle at the University of Washington is that students don't mind the instruction that much on Zoom, but they certainly miss hanging out with their friends, the casual conversations before and after studio and class, just sitting out into the quad, the sort of general sociality of everything, which is what I started our conversation with, remembering the times you and I and all our other friends sat around in the chai shop and the coffee shop outside school. I did not remember the classes we taught together or anything.
I
It-
totally
it-
agree.
I mean, I guess some people would say the only reason why Zoom is working so effectively is because of the force of pressure, right? I mean, because we are isolated, it becomes like this push, which push that and you're like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Okay, I'm going to Zoom Nandan and I'm going to record him. If that force is taken out, then this will collapse like a house of cards. Some people might say that cynically. In which case, the traditional value of architecture, the traditional notion of architecture as the space of convening of bodies, right, will remain in place and in power. Yeah.
I think I'm in complete agreement with that. Let me just qualify it. The fact that Zoom uh, disrupts the learning community in terms of, exactly what you said. Everyone is missing it, including me. That if we were gathering and sitting under a tree and having tea and discussing the same thing as a studio, is a much more enriched experience than on Zoom, even if we were drinking tea at the same time on Zoom. And the fact that one is not able to meet nuances of gestures which you did not have to convey multiple gestures when 8 or 9 are there, and so that of course one misses. And a lot of the learning often happens when one is probably meandering down a stair or one is sitting at the canteen. It's a substantial aspect of that learning. It's not as if it was some service space and the studio was the learning space. It is an extension and probably a very important aspect of the learning. Having said that, I think one, as you rightly said, has no choice in a situation of this nature. If one had the choice and was exercising this, then I would say there's some problem there. But when one doesn't have a choice and then one wants to see that one doesn't reduce oneself to the digital alone as the messiah to convey education, that the digital is enough. I think an embodied experience in each zone, in each home, and its surrounds is what the new program of architecture needs to take into account. And not, I mean, we could have given a program like design a stadium. And I'm sure they would have been sitting designing a stadium, we would have been talking, or design a cultural museum with social distancing in mind. Let's say someone did that. And then someone says you keep tiles which are 6 feet apart in white and black. And so you don't stand in the black tile. And, that's the kind of conversation which is on most often I see. But that is far removed again from the embodied experience. For instance, it was raining in Meghalaya. And we told the students from Meghalaya, just video document the raining. And they started video documenting the raining. In less than 2 hours, the whole studio had understood topography and siting of the building. And it became a game. It was not a exercise anymore. They were gaming, they were seeing the insects there, they were seeing it. It is a voyeuristic National Geographic channel now between the students.
Okay, let's pause on that.
Sure.
Voyeuristic National Geographic channel. I love that phrase. So Zoom education as voyeuristic National Geographic channel. Please explain.
What tends to happen, and I think that's what social media did in a certain way, is that if someone is landing in in Paris or London, or there's a continuous upload of images which are almost recording. It's like um, it's like a certain communication of the to the world on what is happening with self. If one is in Paris, there's an upload. If one is in London, and so social media suddenly broke down that notion of what was otherwise private space and public space.
Yeah. So I think you're on
Yeah,
to something here, my man.
yeah.
Because
So it,
we were earlier celebrating the idea of the embodied knowledge and all that and all that. But what the embodied does not allow is voyeurism, right?
true.
And social, not only social media as such has always thrived on providing voyeurism. National Geographic Channel is the perfect example because we are sitting in our living room and we are watching the cheetah chase the gazelle, You're like,
Absolutely,
oh my God, yes.
absolutely,
And it builds on the idea of cinema in general because when you're in a cinema hall, the room is black and you are like,
absolutely.
you're on a voyeuristic experience, right? So, which is also like, looking through a window at somebody unseen, right? So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
the opposite experience of the embodied experience. So,
absolutely.
so Zoom World sets up a sort of a condition of sanctioned voyeurism,
Yes, it's a participatory voyeurism.
participatory voyeurism. Yeah, it reminds me of that Wim Wenders film, no, Paris, Texas,
Yeah,
where there is, this sort of this video booths, which is sort of participatory voyeurism, right? Uh, so the social economy is of participatory, sanctioned voyeurism. It is true because many times when I'm on Zoom, I want to show everybody my room. Here am I, look at the
it's
places where I bring them in, and everybody's encouraged to do that. And we call that personalization and making people feel comfortable. But it's actually also a certain voyeuristic game. So there's a different social economy at work. And that's why you were also saying, I think earlier that, some people become lions on Zoom, no?
absolutely. So I think what it does. See, there was an just to digress a little, and I'll come back here. There was an interview with Rajnikant, the South Indian larger than
Famous
life,
actor. Yeah.
famous actor. There was an interview with him, and we all happened to be around, and he was being interviewed. And this journalist asked Rajnikant and said, how is it that you have such a following, and you have a following in Russia, you have a following in Japan, and you must be feeling on top of the world, one of the strongest men on earth. And
Yeah.
he said, no, I think you got it all wrong. Let me, since it's an interview and going into the press, let me make it clear here and now.
Yeah.
He said, on the screen, everyone comes and sits in this large auditorium. I'm on this huge screen, and with one left hand, I'm bashing 20 villains or whatever, and then I'm riding on my bike. I'm doing all that. He said, in real life, if I saw even a single man threatening me, I would probably run away. He said, in real life. But that
Yeah.
real life is never experienced or seen.
Yeah.
So what tends to happen is that you have, in a certain sense, built an alternate layer,
Yeah.
and that alternate layer starts speaking unto itself and becomes a part of the reality of our conversation. We don't realize when it is no more a reality. Because it has the power to inspire, it has the power to motivate, it has the power to provide another impetus for a new idea. So
Yeah.
it's still real, even though that image is generated. It's real. Now, what happens here is a little different. I won't put the two together, but in terms of the potential, what happened for us was when the grandmother on her own, we were very conscious of privacy. So we were not discussing with the students in that manner. But certainly the grandmother felt there's this program and the student is measuring the bamboo, is doing that. And for what? The grandmother had never experienced this grandchild sitting and measuring a bamboo or a door and documenting it. And so she decided she had to converse and see what it was. It was a curiosity. And what that curiosity did is that, and they were drawing spaces which the rest of the group could not understand, because the Khasi community home has some amazing undefined redundant spaces. They don't relate to our idea of the living room, dining room. So now how do you converse with the idea of the home when the Khasi community has a very different notion in the way in which they inhabit the space, in the way in which the spatial definition happens? You cannot even use the words like living room, or one cannot use words like dining. It just doesn't fit. And so I had to, I'm sure you know Iben and the others who were there at SEPT at that time. Do you remember Iben and
I don't remember Iben.
Okay, they were all my batchmates from the Northeast, and who are architects settled there. So I had to actually start bringing them into the studio to discuss whether that is the definition and interpretation of the home. Because and that's what I meant by the voyeuristic self-sanction.
Yes,
because
but let's discuss the grandmother. I mean, so she's an interesting figure here, right?
Yes. So what happened is the
no, I mean, the grandmother is provoked because the camera is there, no? And because of Zoom, there is sort of this, not invasion of privacy, but there is sort of a sanctioned documentation of space.
Absolutely.
So it's not like she's being made to talk to the camera, or she's being observed unobserved, like anthropologists are supposed to do. They're supposed to observe in an unobserved manner.
Absolutely.
But she wants to participate.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So she wants to be Rajnikant, right?
Absolutely. So it's really, that's why I said it was a self-sanction. See, otherwise, as an anthropologist, or in that manner, if one is going into a indigenous community, I think you think thrice on the ethics of that act of.
Oh, no ways. Yeah, you wouldn't do it. You'd be very careful.
Yeah, I won't do it. I won't do it. And it's just a certain level of transgression. But here now, if because of Zoom and because of the distance, and because now the choice is really with the community, the choice is not with us. The choice is with the community on when to engage and not. I think what it opened out was something one had not even imagined in the studio. And from Kerala, from Pondicherry, from Jaipur, from the Northeast, and the conversation that it set up within the studio, I would say was the learning experience. Because so I would say Zoom allowed or inadvertently facilitated.
Yeah, but I'm also still trying to zero in on the dynamics. Is like Dadima, the grandmother, now wants to be on camera, right? And in that sense, she wants to be a performer, right?
Absolutely.
So she's putting up a performance. She's not her natural self. But this is also her true representative of her being, which suggests to me that we are all now on stage, right? We are all in the movies.
Absolutely.
We're all everywhere, all the time. So that when we are on a Zoom call now, it's not like just hanging out with Nandan. Particularly if I know it is being recorded, and it should be recorded, there's this imagination. Everybody's worried that Zoom is being recorded somewhere sitting in the Zoom cloud. So everything is now being surveillance society is certainly a big problem now. But that recordability and even actual recordingness and the likelihood of it being sort of sitting on a cloud where it could be overheard brings out the actor in all of us. So we are all
Okay.
sort of in a performance space, I think, all the time, on Zoom. Both voyeuring, and performing for that, through the looking glass, through the video booth. So I think that's the sort of a strange dynamic of Zoom, is that it's recordingness, or so it's existing in the cloudness, while on the one hand is deeply troubling for many because of its invasion of privacy. But on the other hand, it is also, I think, bringing out the Rajnikant in all of us, don't you think?
Yeah, let me since the this has been a 4 or 5 month, so I won't generalize it straight away. There is definitely this aspect to it. There have been several moments where none of the students or nobody speaks in any. So I was a little concerned why there was no conversation. There was no, like, what would have happened in a normal classroom also died out in the middle. And so I used the other phone. I didn't use the Zoom. It was a normal call, and decided to. Began to change the medium. It was either WhatsApp message. I was changing mediums to see what is the nature of response. And an interesting phenomenon that several of the students came back and said is that if we were sitting under the tree and we were talking, I think we would have been more spontaneous. And that Zoom has taken away our spontaneity because we know it gets recorded and gets archived at the end of the semester. So you suddenly have another situation now where what one thought was a normal conversation is being inhibited by the same act of the surveillance society, or because it's being recorded.
Yeah, because being on stage and being on cinema is not everybody's, natural happiness. Now, grandma liked to be on; she wanted to be on stage. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
so it is really a sum total of. So I won't generalize it because sometimes it's a uh, very basic need that happens. At the same time, there are moments where, but I think that pretty much reflects what happened even without Zoom. I would think that in the class, in the studio, while presenting, let's say it was a thematic idea which had a lot of agency or energy in it, there is an element of performance there, or one is giving a lecture in an auditorium. I think there is an element of performance in that too,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
that yeah, so it didn't get induced by Zoom per se at
No, no,
best.
it didn't. It didn't. It didn't. But it sort of made it the default. Like
Okay.
everybody was always on performance stage, whereas in studio or in lecture, you and I as faculty, probably performing, and then some students tend to grandstand. Uh, but it sort of pushed the consciousness of the fact that we are always performing into high resolution,
Mm.
right? I
Mm.
mean, that difference that Rajnikant tried to point out between the screen and the real life, right? I mean, he's performing in real life also, right?
Absolutely,
But
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 it.
but there's a certain magnification on screen which which has to be accounted for. Marshall McLuhan would insist, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But I would say that it in a sense opens up dimensions which probably would not have opened up in another condition. That's all I, because I would think this studio actually evolved in a very enriched way, which may not have happened in a normal studio. Uh, because of the kind of conversation and because of the kind of alleys of cultural memory that the studio could travel. And I think those alleys of cultural memories may not have been possible if it was a singular studio. Because the minute the family realized that there was a kind of a studio building on this, they were opening out more. The video was walking into another home, another settlement. It was, and you suddenly had an expanse, uh, a multiple localized expanse. But when starts when it gets into a conversation, was I would say completely unpredictable, and every day becomes energetic because of that.
Yeah, National Geographic Channel.
Yeah,
That's what
absolutely,
your
absolutely.
metaphor was so perfect.
No, because each day I would sit and watch. I would just it kind of, you're seeing a bamboo village which you wouldn't have imagined, and there's a conversation there, and I mean, you would have wished for it, but it would never happen.
Yeah.
And they were talking, they were giving interpretations. We were seeing the food, we were seeing how it is built. We talked to a contractor, and so it really unfolds in a very different way.
All right.
Um,
No, I agree. So, but as we move towards the end here, we are, we've already spoken for 50 minutes. So that's surprisingly we got to. So my, last question here is, so given all this national geographicing of architectural education, and this access to the fabulous bamboo villages, sort of the sense of voyeuristic cultural anthropology, and sort of access to inhabited habitation that this enables. Now with all this proliferation of richness, when you come back to that deadly studio space with the blank walls, that's going to feel like a desert.
no, I think now you have a choice. I think what this has done is one has a choice to reimagine what that studio will be. Because if 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 the rules of confinement are taken away, that's what you mean, then those are the only circumstances under which I would come back to the studio. When it'll happen, one doesn't know. One has to find a vaccine, and the vaccine has to be distributed, and so it's a long haul. I think I'm not sure, but it's a long haul. But let's say it did happen in the immediate future and one came back. I think right now another imagination, or a which is impacting pedagogy. This is not an imagination which is only impacting a process or which just happened incidentally. I think it is impacting pedagogy at the root of the germination of the modern project itself. And I see it as having that kind of potential now. Because what tended to happen is that we were looking at the first year studio as a ground zero to begin. And now you look at the first year studio as 19 years of experience, of having experienced architecture, experienced society, and this is the 20th year that one is coming in. It's not a first year of studio. And I think if that paradigm changes, the entire conversation will shift from a prejudged frame that is placed into the studio versus a more complex pedagogy that allows a student to unfold and
So,
converse with a frame.
so what you're saying is that finally, therefore, Zoom is going to flush out Bauhaus, right? We're gonna.
If you want to, I didn't want to say it so clearly, but
And I think that is what you are saying, that the modernist sort of mythology, which is sort of generally placed on, somewhat unfairly, on the shoulders of Bauhaus, is finally going to be um, sent out with the bathwater in the Zoom flood?
I think, yeah, if one were to provoke that question, I think what this has done is that a medium like Zoom, which actually creates distance.
But it also creates familiarity because you are deep in somebody's home.
Absolutely. Is so what was seen as
Really brings us
digital
really
distance.
close. I get to see
Absolutely.
real Nandan, not like this fake Nandan who shows up in the studio in all black.
Okay, I'm not sure about that. I'm not discussing that part. I'm saying that the realness, the Zoom discussion, of course, is virtual.
Yeah.
But I would say the reality of being in a situation and shifting the architectural project into that situation, which means around the home, generates a very different kind of a. I would think it. Maybe I should send some of the drawings and what has emerged, so then it gives a clarity. But I think that is where we are going now.
Well, Nandan, it's always such a pleasure to wildly speculate and theorize with unfeathered wings with you. And I must say, even though we are not sitting under the trees of CEPT campus, it has still been quite a pleasure. Thank you for being on Architecture Talk.
Thank you, Vikram. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.